All right, kids, welcome to Climate 8 Human Impact. Today is going to be all about climate change and the way that humans have contributed and partly caused the warming of Earth's atmosphere that we've been experiencing over the last 100 years or so. Before we get to that, though, take a look at this launch question. If you're stuck with it, take a look at your Climate 6 slides from last week. They should give you some help with answering this question. All right, welcome back. So this question says, which list contains three major greenhouse gases found in Earth's atmosphere? So the correct answer here was definitely choice A, carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. If we look at that slide from Climate 6 from last week, we can see those list of gases there. Remember, greenhouse gases are ones that absorb infrared radiation or heat coming off of the Earth. So as we increase the amount of these gases, like water vapor or carbon dioxide or methane, the Earth's atmosphere heats up and the Earth becomes warmer as a result. So just a little review from last week. We're going to be talking mostly about carbon dioxide today. All right, before we get into that, take a second and pause this video and watch this video about climate change from Bill Nye, and then we'll come back in a few minutes. All right, so we're going to talk about a little bit more some of the things that Bill and I discussed in that video. Firstly, the way that humans have caused climate change. You're going to learn next week that there are some natural events that can cause climate change. Today, we're really just going to focus on how human activities have caused the average temperature of Earth to increase over the last 150 years or so. All right, so how does this happen? What have humans done to cause the Earth to heat up? Firstly, it's mainly by the burning of fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are things that we use to get energy that come from things that were once alive. So we're talking about coal, oil, natural gas, things that are made of carbon that formed after living organisms were buried beneath the ground in swamps and jungles and forests. And those organic components eventually broke down to become our fossil fuels that we burn today. So when we burn these fuels and we use them for energy, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And as you already know, carbon dioxide is one of those major greenhouse gases that absorbs heat. The other way that humans have contributed a lot to climate change is through deforestation. Deforestation is simply the act of cutting down trees or forests. So this definitely contributes to climate change because, as you know from your living environment classes, trees and plants and forests, they undergo photosynthesis. And to do that, they need carbon dioxide. So if we're cutting down all of these trees and forests and areas that are going to take in more carbon dioxide, that's going to result in a lot more of that CO2 being in the atmosphere, and of course is going to cause the Earth to heat up even more. So here is a really common example of a graph that climate change activists use to try to spread awareness. This graph is showing that as we have increased the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, the temperature has steadily rose as a result. We can see a very, very simple correlation between these two factors in the atmosphere here. So why has the amount of carbon dioxide risen so much since the mid-1800s? As you probably learned from your global history classes, in the mid to late 1800s, that's when the Industrial Revolution started. It's when we really started burning things like coal and natural gas and oil in order to fuel some of the technologies that we were developing at that time. So since technologies become more and more prevalent in our society, we've been burning more and more of these fossil fuels, and that's a major reason why the Earth is getting warmer and warmer. So that leads us to something called the urban heat island effect. We all live in New York City, and if you've ever traveled outside of the city to maybe Long Island or New Jersey or upstate New York, you'll notice that the temperature drops about 5 to 10 degrees as you get further and further outside of the city. All right, and that's because urban areas or cities, they tend to be warmer than less populated areas such as suburban areas or farms or rural areas. And this is also because of human activities. When we build and create cities, we're modifying our land surfaces. We're taking areas that are covered in grass or trees or plants, and we're cutting them down and then paving over them with dark colored roads and buildings and other things that make up our city. And as we learned last week, things that are darker or rougher in texture, they tend to absorb more heat, and that makes them warmer. On top of that, there's also tons of cars in cities. There is a lot of factories and a lot of buildings that are giving off a lot of wasted heat energy. So that also is going to cause cities to become warmer and warmer. And since the 1800s, we've done nothing but make cities bigger and build more and more cities. So once again, just contributing more to climate change through urbanization. All right, so this is a really common graph that's also shown or shows the urban heat island effect. In downtown city areas where you have most of your factories and buildings, that's when temperatures tend to be the warmest. But as you get further and further away from the main parts of the city and head to more suburban or even rural farmland areas, the temperature tends to decrease more and more and more. The coolest parts of a city tend to be the park areas, the areas that still have some vegetation and still some greenness. So moving on, not only do cities contribute to climate change, but agriculture does as well. And agriculture is just a simple word to describe farming and the raising of livestock, or animals that we raise to eventually eat as food. So these livestock, cows, cattle, they require tons of land. In order to provide them with that land, we have to cut down trees. And the same goes with farms and crops as well. They require tons and tons of land and less trees. So as the human population steadily increases more and more, our need for a lot of food and crops becomes more and more and more, and that also contributes to climate change. On top of that, food needs to be transported. You know, we eat a lot of plants and vegetables and meats that don't come from New York or aren't grown in New York. So we have to get them from somewhere. So that requires more transportation and, of course, more burning fossil fuels. And as we also learned a little bit about last week, livestock, they produce methane, which is another major greenhouse gas. And if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can watch this video down here and then come back to these slides or the screencast when you're done. All right, so lastly for today, what is the evidence that the Earth is warming up? How do we know that climate change is actually happening and it's not just some kind of hoax that people are making up? Firstly, we can measure temperature. We can go back hundreds, if not thousands of years by looking at ice cores in Antarctica or other glaciers around Earth to see what the temperature of Earth's atmosphere was like hundreds or once again thousands of years into the past. So we know the Earth is heating up by measuring temperature over time. Secondly, we're seeing changes in precipitation patterns. Storms are getting worse. We're seeing wackier weather in times of year when it really shouldn't happen. And this is also happening because our atmosphere is changing. Thirdly, and maybe most importantly, is melting ice. Huge glaciers and our polar ice caps, every single year they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller because as the Earth warms up, that ice is eventually going to melt. And that melting of all of that ice is resulting in rising sea levels. People or places or cities that are along the coastlines, they really got to be concerned about this. There have been studies that predict by the year 2100, less than 80 years from now, sea level is going to rise over 3 feet. That doesn't sound like a drastic number, but there are tons and tons of people, including many New Yorkers, who live within 3 feet of sea level right now. So that's really a major, major concern. You can see this picture down here. This is a glacier from the state of Montana in the United States. And you can see in less than 100 years, the size of that glacier has drastically decreased as the Earth has become warmer and warmer. So here's a little GIF with some satellite images of the size of the polar ice caps. And you can see from the mid-1980s, as we stretch here into the 1990s and eventually the 2000s, the size of this ice is drastically getting smaller and smaller. It pretty much increases a little bit every winter as temperatures cool down, but in the summer as temperatures warm up, the resulting sea ice near the North and South Poles is getting smaller and smaller. So here you can see a satellite image comparing 1979 and 2012, and that is just such a stark difference in the amount of ice that's near the North Pole there. Once again, just showing that the Earth is heating up. All right, if you have a little more interest into a lot of you have Netflix. There's a really good series on Netflix called Our Planet, and it's showing some of the results of climate change, especially what we call glacial calving. We're seeing huge amounts of glaciers and polar ice caps just being kind of broken off and eventually melting into the oceans, once again causing sea level to rise. All right, and finally, last slide here. This is a map of the United States, and this map is showing how many people, what population is living less than 3.3 feet above mean high water or mean sea level. Once again, as I spoke about a few minutes ago, a lot of climatologists and scientists believe that sea level is going to rise over 3 feet by the year 2100. So states like Florida, states like New York or California, we have thousands of people living within that area, which could eventually be underwater due to rising sea level. All right, people, there is tons and tons more I could talk about climate change, but I'm trying my best to keep these videos short. If you want to learn a little bit more about this, I provided some links for you. Definitely some interesting, good stuff. One of them is about a teenage climate activist from Sweden. Her name is Greta Thunberg. You could watch her TED Talk. There's also a link here about little things that you can do to try to help the Earth a little bit and try to prevent climate change a little more. But as always, make sure you're clicking this link at the top here. These are your 5 multiple choice questions that you need to submit for Climate 8. There is a link to the reference tables over here, although I don't think you need them for any of these questions today. If you have any questions at all, feel free to email me or come talk to me during our Google Hangout, and have a good week.